Thanks, everyone. So thanks for the opportunity. Without much ado, I would request Sushma to start the program.
Good evening, everyone. Warm welcome to all of you to the session on medical management of glaucoma. And as you all know that we have Dr. GC as chair, and it's my proud privilege to introduce him. Dr. GC has been associated with LVP since 1986, I think, and currently the vice chair of LVP. He has a big stature in ophthalmology, so I really don't have to introduce him. So just to add a couple of lines is that he's a clinical professor at University of San Diego as well as University of Rochester, and is also one of the panel members of WGA, that is World Glaucoma Association. I think he has trained more than 50 glaucoma specialists all across India as well as world. So one peculiar thing I would want to tell about him as a student is despite of his stature, he has the capability of being as strict as a teacher, as caring as a parent, and can be as understanding as a friend. So a warm welcome to you, sir. And I'm really grateful that you could make it for us. After this, I think we'll open up the session. And I will hand it over to Shoruba, who would be taking care of the talks in sequence. Dr. Shoruba has been working with Narayana Nethralaya since long. She's been working as consultant since last 9 years. And in addition to her clinical and research capabilities, she's also learning law these days. So I have a lot of things to learn from her, Shoruba. So carry on, over to you.
So thank you, ma'am. Good evening, everyone. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our chairperson, Dr. GC, and all our speakers and the audience. We will be starting with the talks, and in the interest of time, we will take questions from the audience at the end of the entire session. So look forward to an interesting and stimulating session. Let's begin with the first talk for today on guidelines on medical management of glaucoma by Dr. Sushma Tejwani. Dr. Sushma is a senior consultant and head of the glaucoma department in Narayana Nethralaya 2. She has done her fellowship from LV Prasad Eye Institute and has undergone glaucoma training at the Mayo Clinic. With more than 14 years of experience, she is a passionate teacher and many residents and fellows have trained under her. She has presented at various national and international conferences and is the recipient of several prestigious awards. She is currently pursuing her PhD in corneal biomechanics and molecular biology in glaucoma. Over to you, ma'am.
Thanks, Shoruba. So I would just set up the tone of the meeting by just giving some basic guidelines on medical management of glaucoma, when and how to use anti-glaucoma medications. Well, the goal of glaucoma treatment is to preserve the visual field and prevent the loss of visual function. And the idea is to have minimum number and concentration of drugs to achieve the maximum lowering of IOP for a given patient. So according to most of the clinical trials, right from ocular hypertension to advanced glaucoma, we know that IOP lowering is the most important goal, and it is important to slow the onset and progression of glaucoma. Looking at the risk reduction of progression at each millimeters of mercury of IOP in different randomized control trials, we very well know that risk reduction with pressure lowering is large, and that is what the goal is. So the lower is the better. Now, we set the target IOP for each patient based on the multiple factors. What we understand by target IOP is that it is an IOP range at which the disease progression is unlikely to affect the patient's quality of life. So there is no validated algorithm or formula to calculate the target IOP, but it can be individualized based on different aspects or of a patient. Now, it has to be also re-evaluated or recalculated over a period of time. So what we need to look at when we are calculating or determining a target IOP range for a given patient is that we need to look at what is the damage at the presentation, what is the life expectancy of a patient, whether we are dealing with a young or a old patient, what is the presenting intraocular pressure, what are additional risk factors, and most importantly, we also over a period of time look at rate of progression and then keep changing or readjusting our target intraocular pressure. Now, according to AAO guidelines, we need to reduce the pressure definitely by less than 25% for the pre-treatment value, and then based on the amount of damage and type of glaucoma. Similarly, the EGS also suggests that we reduce the IOP to teens or late teens for moderate to advanced glaucoma in POAG, and low teens in normal tension glaucoma patients. Now, when do we plan for medical therapy? What are the things that we need to keep in mind? One is the efficacy of the drug at its best, indication as per the type of glaucoma, what are the contraindications in a given patient, the socio-economic status of a patient, systemic issues, and also we need to understand that we need to maximize the compliance. Now, there are different types of drugs. Just to tell you what is the first line, drugs are largely prostaglandins and beta blockers. The second lines are alpha agonists and topical CIAs. And there are drugs like pilocarpine, oral carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, and the newer drugs now that you would be listening towards the later part of the session. Both the first line drugs like beta blocker and prostaglandins reduce the pressure to 30 to 50%. What I need to speak about each drug is only things that we need to take care when we are prescribing a drug. We need to understand that there is a possibility of tachyphylaxis when we are using beta blockers. Then there is a long-term drift that can happen with beta blockers over a period of time. So we need to keep a watch in case the beta, for patients who are on beta blockers for long-term, whether there is a pressure increase that we are seeing. And we also need to keep in mind the systemic side effects of the drug. When we are talking about prostaglandin analogs, these are largely a group of drugs which have local adverse events. They don't have much of systemic effects, but they are contraindicated in certain diseases like herpetic eye disease, uveitis, or inflammatory glaucomas. And compliance is an important factor that is favorable for this group class of drugs. Dorzolamide has an additional property of vasoprotection. The animal models have clearly shown that. However, the human models, we have a few studies which tell us that it increases the flow, blood flow as measured by the laser interferometric methods in fundus pulsation and on the optic nerve as well as macula. So although we don't have a definitive advantage of that, whether it affects the, whether it affects the visual field. Now, if we talk about brimonidine, again, it is known to have some neuroprotection. There has been a few very limited human experiments where it has been reported to have improvement in visual field as compared to the other intraocular pressure lowering drugs with the same amount of IOP control. However, the direct evidence is still lacking. So keeping these things in mind, what usually we decide about a particular drug in a given patient. Let's keep in mind certain WGA consensus statements that when we are comparing the efficacy of a drug, we are looking at the IOP lowering effect and not the parallel effects as I discussed just now. For initiation, prostaglandin is the most accepted or first choice agent for most of the eyes with glaucoma unless contraindicated. IOP reduction with initial monotherapy should be 20% from the baseline, and less than 10% is considered non-response. Adjunctive therapy should be limited from one drug from each class and not multiple drugs from the same class. Fixed dose combinations do help to reduce the preservative installation. And when the medical therapy fails, we need to definitely consider surgery for patients. Now, just a few tips to select the drug. Beta blockers are best avoided in systemically compromised patients. PG analogs are best avoided in unilateral glaucoma or secondary glaucomas. Dorzolamide is best avoided in ocular surface diseases or when the endothelium is compromised. Brimonidine is a bit preferred in NTG, but I would not say for sure. And pilocarpine is still an option, and we need to remember when we need additional drop in the intraocular pressure. According to GSI recommendation, if the initial therapy does not reduce the pressure by 20%, we need to switch the drug. And we should discontinue and start another drug. Switching can be done from one class to the other. However, in prostaglandin situation, we can also shift from one prostaglandin to the other prostaglandin. What are the indications to switch? If the pressure reduction is not enough, if you see tachyphylaxis with beta blockers, if you need that additional 1 or 2 millimeter drop in the IOP, so you can shift to a more potent, say, PG analog. And if you have intolerability to the drug and compliance issue with the patient, then again, that would be a relative indication to switch. When do we add a drug? When monotherapy is not sufficient to achieve the target pressure, when the patient is already on 2 or more medication, but you still need to reduce the pressure a bit before you plan surgery. When we are combining the drugs, we don't expect any additivity, but when we are using the 2 agents from same class, and that is the reason why we should be using only 1 agent from each class. Typically, when we use the drug as an adjunctive therapy, the efficacy of the drug reduces. And whenever we are adding a drug or starting a new drug, we should check the efficacy before we look at the other drug. So when we use the additive therapy with the beta blocker, this is the kind of percentage drop that you get with each additional class of drug. And if you've started with PG analog, again with each drug, this is the kind of percentage drop that you can get. And that is how we work towards the combination therapy. While adding, what we need to remember is that as we are adding a drug, we are going lower on the compliance. So we should also look at fixed dose combinations when we have checked the efficacy of a particular drug so as to improve the compliance. Now, fixed dose combinations help us because they can give the same effect as 2 separate instillations. We have lower number of vials and applications and lower amount of ocular preservatives. You don't need to adjust the time gap between the drugs. And also it reduces the cost for the patient. So I think we are going to have the talk on the compliance issues. So I will not go much in detail, but we do definitely see that in future, we are going to reduce the number of bottles and number of drops. So the fewer, the better. However, what we need to keep in mind that it is that we have to maintain the intraocular pressure throughout the day and night and over the long term. So we need to look at those aspects as well. To minimize the side effects, this is a double dot technique that you should teach the patient. Either they can occlude the tear duct by occlusion, or they can close the eye for 5 minutes after instilling the drop so that you reduce the systemic concentration by 2/3 and they don't have the side effects. So just to take you through the algorithm, when you have given a first drug and you've reached the target with minimal side effects and patient is able to tolerate, we can continue treatment and monitor. If not, then we have to look at whether the drug is partially effective or has side effects. If it is ineffective, we definitely discard and then go to the second drug. And if it gets controlled, then again continue. Similarly, you can have third drug and fourth drug adding like that based on what is the efficacy of the drug and tolerability of the drug to the patient. And if with all the drugs, the target is not achieved, then this is when you think about laser or surgery. So just to tell you about the caveats that we are talking about in this whole presentation is the guidelines are largely for primary open angle glaucoma and can be applied to angle closure glaucoma only after peripheral iridotomy. When we are dealing with secondary glaucomas, based on the cause of glaucoma, the management may vary. And certain aggressive glaucomas may require surgery at a much earlier stage. So to end, the key points for medical management are that target IOP needs to be determined based on rate of progression along with age, presenting IOP and damage. We can confidently recommend further IOP lowering in patients who are not doing well or having risk factors for progression. We should check the efficacy of the drug before adding any other drug. We can use multiple drugs in form of fixed combinations or separate or add-on therapies when we need further reduction of IOP. And the fast progressors need to be looked at and need a stronger intervention with better drugs or surgery. Well, so the sooner you start the treatment, the lower the IOP and the lesser are the medicines, the better it is for the patient. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, ma'am, for setting the stage with the basics of glaucoma. So I would like to ask Dr. GC if he would like to share his thoughts before we move on.
I guess very nicely summarized, Sushma. Thank you. You've given a lot of information in a very short time. So I hope people have caught on to what you have said. I think the importance of setting a target IOP based on the clinical condition, differentiating those people who are rapid progressors versus people who are probably having a relatively stable disease is something that we can probably establish only over a period of follow-up, but based on the age at which the patients present, the residual life that they're expected to have, young versus old age group, and the amount of damage present at the presentation is one thing that will decide the target IOP. It's possible to reach the target IOP in a large number of patients with medical therapy. When you have not reached the target IOP, I think a close monitoring to see the rate of progression of the disease, especially in the patients with earlier damage, minimal damage versus those with more severe damage where your threshold for surgery and to the next step might be much lower, and you may not have too much time to play with too many medications that are available at this point of time. I think the points that she stressed about dealing with the primary versus secondary glaucoma, selecting each of medication, and being careful about not adding too many medications that may not be actually efficacious in reducing the IOP in a given patient, I think are all very important. So with those probably few points to recapitulate, we can move on and take questions towards the end of the session.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Just want to remind our audience, if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat box below, and we will come to those questions. Our panelists will answer your questions at the end of the entire session. So let's move on to the second talk for today, the role of communication with patients to improve compliance, by Dr. Sushmita Kaushik. Dr. Sushmita is a professor in the Advanced Eye Clinic, PGI Chandigarh. She is a passionate teacher and has more than 100 publications in peer-reviewed journals. She has been a reviewer for almost all reputed ophthalmology journals, including IOVS, Ophthalmology, Archives of Ophthalmology, AJO, BJO, IJO, and some others. She has held several leadership positions, including as former secretary of the GSI and is the founder secretary for the Indian Pediatric Glaucoma Society. Welcome, ma'am.
You are muted, Dr. Sushmita. Can you unmute, please?
Unmute myself.
Yes. Yeah.
Is that better? Okay.
Yes. Now it's okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Okay, at the outset, thank you very much, AIOS and Dr. Sushma, for having me on. And it's always daunting to present in front of Dr. GC sir, but I'll do my best. So the role of communication to improve compliance. And as we gray more and more, we realize that more often than not, the problem is that we haven't said what we assume the patient knows. So why it's important, especially for glaucoma, is because the nature and impact of glaucoma is not actually understood until it's too late. And patients are non-compliant. They do miss follow-up appointments. And at the heart of the problem is that it's asymptomatic before it reaches the advanced stage. So if you communicate effectively, it enhances the patient's understanding of their disease as well as their need for treatment. And that, we hope, may result in better compliance. So let's look at it from the patient's point of view. The problem is that mild to moderate glaucomatous optic nerve damage is usually asymptomatic. They were perfectly fine. They've gone for glasses and somebody has said that, look, it looks like you have glaucoma. And as the disease advances, these are things which they're not too easily explained to their doctor, but they do have difficulty with peripheral vision. They have difficulty with contrast. There's more glare. Their adjustments between light and dark become more difficult, and there's still clear central vision. So more often than not, they'll have a Snellen's acuity and somebody will tell them, oh, it's all fine, don't worry, have a vitamin tablet or something. It's only when it's severe glaucoma that it's totally irreversible blindness, and that's when we've lost the battle. So the cornerstones of communication really is, I think, listening to the patients and not brushing aside 100% contrast Snellen's acuity, answering questions face to face and demonstrating the nature of the disease and its effects with maybe drawings and nowadays lots of photographs. So if you convince a patient as to what the problem is and what the problem could be if they're not compliant, that I think will make a difference. Now, at least in setups like ours and many others, the barriers are simply the lack of time, unregulated patient flow. It's all very well to say these things, to talk to them and spend time and all that, but we know, especially in tertiary care centers, that urgent patients and serious patients take up most of our time. So we don't bother with patients who we think are okay, but then there would be a time when they would not be okay. So if we want to reduce that, we might as well start communicating. So these are a little bit of strategies which we've learned along the way and probably might be helpful. So one is avoid asking a yes or no question. Are you putting your drops regularly? Will always elicit a yes, I'm putting my drops regularly. But if you think the patient is not compliant, one trick I've learned is to ask them straight on, so since when have you missed your dose? And usually this elicits days or even weeks that, oh, it was over and I had my appointment in the next week, so I thought I might as well show you before I bought a new medication, and so on and so forth. So a simple check of the bottle and the amount of remaining drugs. If you ask them, when was this bottle bought? And if he said 3 weeks ago and it's nearly half full, you don't have to ask him anything else. The other thing is be alert to the signs of poor compliance. So you need to watch out and just ask. So if there is increased frequency of missed appointments, you must understand that a patient who's not serious about visits may not be serious about treatment either. The other thing is self-reporting. If the patient insists on saying, I'm very compliant, I always put my drugs, I never miss a single drop, you must remember something is wrong somewhere. And then, of course, lack of understanding of the disease. Everybody has very busy lifestyles. Oh, I had a meeting. Oh, I have to go here, there. And then let's not get away from the fact that there's dissatisfaction with the physician and long waiting times at clinics, which tells them that there's no point in really going there, because after waiting for 4 hours, I'll be, seen off in 5 minutes and be told everything is fine. There might be unstable family conditions, which we don't talk about because our patients are elderly, and there might be lots of issues with them being able to be in a position where they don't help themselves too much. So ascertain why your patient is non-compliant. Are there multiple comorbidities? Somebody on a wheelchair with multiple other things might think putting a drop in the eye is the least of his worries. Is there no support system at home? Is there a problem with the medication? Now this is so common. Sometimes the treatment is simply more troublesome than the disease, and they simply couldn't bother about putting too many drops. So these are just suggested steps to detect adherence. Begin with a direct, open-ended question. So tell me how you've been taking your medications, and the response will reveal their level of understanding. And a follow-up question would be, but you're so busy, how do you organize medication? And how do you remember to take them? Then change the patient's expectation that you'll be judgmental. Tell them that you know that non-compliance is universal. So you change the definition of a good patient, and you understand, and you understand that there would be problems as well. So explain how information about adherence will affect decisions. So he says, if you tell them, look, your pressure is higher than it should be, but before we change the prescription, let's make sure that you've been able to use the medication you're already on. So that makes the patient understand that he might as well be truthful. Otherwise, you'll just have another bottle and another cost to it without really helping. Finally, ask about forgetting or missing medications if they do. In the post-op patient, what we've learned is never ever send a patient to the pharmacy with a list of drugs prescribed. There are too many times when we've seen patients put antibiotics 1 hourly and steroids 3 times a day if you wanted the other way around. Ask to get the drops, explain them, and helps to have the bottles marked with a pen for the frequency to be instilled. We just put little dots on it, and that helps. Tell the patient about time. This is something which I have in my clinic. And I tell them a 30-second interval has almost a 50% washout. A 2-minute interval has much less. But if you wait for 5 minutes, those 2 drops are likely to have no washout at all. I just like to share this. I can't resist not showing a baby. So this 6-week-old baby had a goniotomy done. And we thought we'd done a good job. And we called him back 5 weeks later. And he actually had exogenous Cushing's just with betamethasone 4 times a day bilaterally. So sometimes it's important. We forget that that drop meant for an 80 kg man is not enough for a 2.5 kg newborn as well. So we need to remember that and explain punctal occlusion and all that. Periodic interactions, we have this sadly just about twice a year, but they help very much. They show that we are as human as the patients are. And major gains of effective communication are to gain the patient's trust, and that's half the battle won. A patient understands what the disease is, why we are treating, how we are treating, and invariably leads to better adherence. Making friends with children and communicating with them makes them very good patients. The cause of concern is even in the best of centers, patients are infrequently listened to. This wonderful article I found by David Friedman in the analysis of videotaped encounters in community office practice showed that physicians spend an average of 8 minutes in the room with the patient and an average of 5.8 minutes talking to the patient. And if this is in the best of centers, I wonder what we do. So in a nutshell, it's key, more important in diseases like glaucoma. Tell the patient what to expect, educate them about what they should know, be involved, and care. Patients respond much better to a doctor who's concerned. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Sushmita, for putting up a very important topic together, that how important it is to maintain the compliance in addition to prescribing drops. That is only 10% of the job done. Making them put the medicine is more of a challenge. So can I ask one question, Dr. GC, on this? What would you say on how many times you actually need to do surgery or do something drastic for compliance issues?
I think if you understand that it is the compliance issue, I'm sure you will not operate. We operate because we don't, in the first step, understand that there is an issue with the compliance. So I think it's important as physicians for us to understand that there may be a compliance issue. And if there is a compliance issue, the responsible person is the physician and me rather than the patient. And we have to own up that responsibility. It is because of my mistake that there is poor compliance. As far as I think, let me at the outset, probably on a later one, let me tell Sushmita that it's not a daunting task to present in front of me. I keep learning from Sushmita's talk every single time I listen to her because I respect her a lot. So having said that, I think this is a very important topic that you have raised. And if I may add a few thoughts in addition to what Sushmita has said, having answered your point that the reason we operate in situations where it is not necessary is because we don't understand that we are the root cause of the problem and we have not communicated with the patient. In situations where the patient is compliant and the disease is bad, we need to operate. If we are not procrastinating, I think that is fine. We should not procrastinate, that is fine. From the point of view of glaucoma, the additional things that I would add to what probably Sushmita said is we need to differentiate between patients who are overly worried about the disease and the disease is not very severe, because you have glaucoma suspects who are worried to death because somebody in the family has gone blind with glaucoma. They have done a lot of Google search and they think only of blindness and nothing else. And the chance of that patient going blind with glaucoma is probably extremely small based on the disease severity that they have. So we need to be supportive in that situation rather than blame them for non-compliance and things like that. On the other hand, you also have patients who have bad disease, who are busy executives, have a lot of responsibilities. A busy executive is not just a person working in an office, but also a mother taking care of her family. They're also busy, they neglect themselves. So I think in that situation, we need to be a little more harsh and tell them that their disease is bad. They need to take care of them before they can take care of others. And as we communicate this, I think differentiating the patients in these two categories is important. But only when you differentiate, you will know in a busy clinic with whom you need to spend a little more time. So to be able to do that, you need to read the patient's body language. And only then you will be able to differentiate them. So talking about body language, we also need to remember that the patients are reading our body language. And if you can communicate to the patient that you are genuinely interested in their well-being and preserving their vision, not adding one more case to your research study or one more patient to your surgical list, then they will trust you. I think that's an important part of communication that we tend to miss, that we are being assessed by the patient as we are assessing the patient. So these are the two additional thoughts I'll share and let you continue.
Thanks, Dr. GC. And if we have any questions for Dr. Sushmita, I think we should take up now, Shoruba, because she has to leave for a EPG session after this. Do we have any
Yes, ma'am.
questions from audience?
There's no questions from the audience as such, but I was just wondering if Dr. Sushmita would like to say anything in terms of whether you use any specific methods to monitor compliance in patients, like some people do recommend maintaining a diary, or is there anything that you would recommend? Ma'am, you're mute.
Yeah, I think the endpoint for us is the intraocular pressure that we are expecting. That's the main thing. And the first question that I ask my residents when they're presenting is, what was the pressure when you started? Because that's what they forget. So I think that's the objective thing, because usually with us, by the time the patients come, everybody seems to be very good. Yeah, I put my drops every day. Yeah, I don't miss a single dose, so mostly. But what has helped is what I said. If I suspect, I don't ask. I just say, okay, now tell me, since when has your medication been over? And then they think I'm a partner, and they do tell me that. So, but there's nothing specific as whatever.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sushmita, for being part of this. And I think with that, we will proceed further, Shoruba.
Sure. So moving on to our third talk for today, what to keep in mind while using glaucoma medications in special situations, by Dr. Sati Devi. Dr. Sati is a senior consultant and head of the glaucoma department at Narayan Nethralaya 1. She completed her undergraduate training from Bangalore Medical College and then did her post-graduation from Minto Eye Hospital, and following that her fellowship from Shankar Nethralaya, Chennai. She is also actively involved in teaching programs, and several residents and fellows have received their glaucoma training under her. With over 20 years of glaucoma practice, Dr. Sati brings a wealth of experience and knowledge with her. Welcome, ma'am.
Thanks, Shoruba. So I'll be talking on what we need to keep in mind while using glaucoma medications in special situations. So Dr. Sushma was talking about the medications that were used in primary open angle glaucoma and in angle closure. But there are certain discrete glaucomas or discrete group of patients who might require certain specific medications. So we need to use what we call directed therapy here. We are not just trying to use every drug that's available in the armamentarium. And in different situations, the first drug of choice may vary, and it's important for us to be aware of this. So coming to our first group of patients, the infants and children. So when a child with congenital or infantile glaucoma is there, we are aware that definitive treatment in these group of patients is definitely surgery. However, before you actually schedule the patient for surgery, you may want to start the patient on medications to try and lower the pressure prior to surgery itself. Or even post-surgery, if the control of intraocular pressure has not been adequate, then you may want to add one or two medications as adjunctive medical therapy post-surgery. What's important to remember is that these children are not small adults. Because they have a lower body weight and a lower blood volume, the drops in these eyes can reach much higher systemic concentration when we use these topically applied drops. So it's important to teach NLD occlusion. Often side effects that we may never see in an adult may become evident in children, just as I think Dr. Sushmita just showed this about how steroids can cause a problem. Similarly, glaucoma medications also, side effects may be very evident in a child as against in the adult. So we would like to use the least number of medications with the lowest concentration. Parents as well as the pediatrician should be made aware of the possible side effects and to keep a watch for the same. So what are the drugs? Definitely we could try and use topical carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. They are safe and effective. However, with systemic carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, they would need close monitoring, or if possible to avoid, because they can cause rapid and severe acidosis. So one has to be extremely careful and probably under the supervision of a pediatrician. Topical beta blockers are effective, no doubt, but again, here systemic safety is a concern. Neonatal apnea as well as bradycardia, all these have been reported, so one has to be careful. Bitoxolol, which is more selective, is safer than timolol. Prostaglandin analogs can be used, but these are less effective in children because of a possible aberrant outflow tract that is seen in this type of glaucoma. Topical brimonidine, most important to remember, is absolutely contraindicated in children less than 2 years, because these tend to cross the blood-brain barrier and have been known to cause severe CNS depression. Even in children older than 2 and less than 14, it has to be used only with great caution, or if possible, best to avoid. Miotics are rarely used in phakic children. Coming to a person maybe with a juvenile glaucoma who is now pregnant, what do we do? What are the medications that we could give? So in the management of a glaucoma patient who is pregnant, one has to balance the risk to the fetus with treatment versus the risk to the mother if treatment is reduced or suspended. So the typical algorithm would be in pregnancy to probably observe. So if you're just seeing the ocular hypertensive with a pressure of 23, 24, you think that there's an option for not really treating, discs are healthy, you could wait and just observe and not put the patient on any medications. Laser trabeculoplasty is a very safe option. If none of this is sufficient to control the pressures, then we would need to look at medical management. Again, the importance of NLD occlusion in this situation. With drugs, there is the risk of teratogenicity. The drugs could interfere with the maintenance of pregnancy, and they could cause side effects in the neonate. In the event of the patient having uncontrolled severe disease, one might even want to consider incisional surgery. Of course, here you would not want to use adjunctive antifibrotic agents. So what are the drugs? We would want to avoid prostaglandin analogs in women who are pregnant and even in those who are planning pregnancy, because these are being prostaglandins can potentially cause contraction of the uterine smooth muscle. We know that the systemic concentration of these drugs are extremely small, but we are really not aware what effects they could have. And without sufficient data, it would be best to avoid these medications. Beta blockers and alpha agonists can cause serious toxicity, both respiratory and CNS depression, and hence they should be withdrawn during the last few weeks of pregnancy. Topical carbonic anhydrase inhibitors are generally well tolerated. So up to 8 months, you can give the beta blockers, you can give alpha agonists, and then in the last month of pregnancy, you would want to stop these medications. You could continue the topical carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. Pilocarpine can be given safely, but being a younger age group, we are not sure whether this can be tolerated. But if it's tolerated for some reason, if it's a pseudophakic eye who requires and who is able to tolerate pilocarp, then it may be given in this situation. What should be avoided again is systemic carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, because these are potentially teratogenic, and as I already mentioned, to avoid prostaglandin analogs. During lactation, you could continue with the topical carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, and now the prostaglandin analogs can be started. Again, pilocarpine can be safely used during lactation. Definitely to avoid beta blockers and alpha agonists, as well as systemic carbonic anhydrase, because of the risk of these drugs transmitting to the neonate through the breast milk. If the patient comes to us before she is pregnant, then the possibility of, like I said, the safe procedure of laser trabeculoplasty can be done. You would want to again avoid prostaglandin analogs, because for whatever risk that may be there to the maintenance of pregnancy. But if you see that the patient has advanced disease, is already on multiple medications, then you could plan surgical intervention prior to conception, so that then the pregnancy becomes easier and you don't have to worry about medications during pregnancy. Coming to pigmentary glaucoma, Prostaglandin analogs, which work by improving the outflow, are a group of medications that work best in this situation. However, a small factor that we need to keep in mind is whether over long-term use by increasing iridal pigmentation, could this exacerbate the pigmentary glaucoma, something we need to keep in mind. Beta blockers, alpha agonists, and carbonic anhydrase inhibitors all effectively decrease IOP in this condition. However, again, aqueous suppressants, because of the reduced aqueous in the posterior chamber, it could give rise to a greater iridozonular contact. So the space for the posterior chamber is reduced, and so the iridozonular contact may be greater. The decreased aqueous flowing through the trabecular meshwork may also allow greater blockage and dysfunction of the trabecular meshwork over time. And because this group of glaucomas affects young adults, we need to remember and keep in mind the greater sensitivity to psychological and sexual side effects in this age group, like depression, anxiety, loss of libido, and impotence. So what is the role of pilocarpine and pigmentary glaucoma? They definitely help in lowering the intraocular pressure. And because of the meiosis, it tends to stretch and flatten the iris from the concave configuration that is known to occur in this situation. Because of this, it relieves the iridozonular contact and reverses the mechanism. However, we also have to remember that 80% of patients of pigment dispersion syndrome are myopic. There is a 7% incidence of retinal detachment in these patients. Also, lattice and breaks are more common as compared to a same degree of myopia in the unaffected population. These eyes are known to have more incidence of lattice and breaks, and hence, in the event that you would want to prescribe, peripheral retinal evaluation becomes mandatory. Also, being younger patients, they tend to have accommodative spasm-induced myopia and blurred vision, and so they may not tolerate the drug very well. The role of YAG-PI, we know, is a little controversial, but in the early stages, at the time of where the pigments are being liberated, it may be beneficial to reverse the mechanism. Coming to pseudoexfoliation glaucoma, prostaglandin analogs again form first line here. One could also use beta blockers and alpha agonists. Carbonic anhydrase inhibitors should be used with a little bit of caution after examining the endothelium carefully. And if you do suspect, it would be better to get a specular, because sometimes the pseudoexfoliation keratopathy can give rise to a very unhealthy endothelium in these eyes. Meiotics again help because they open up the angles, they improve the outflow, they can also minimize the rubbing and the release of the pseudoexfoliation material. However, again, in many of these patients also have cataract, and with the meiosis, patients may not tolerate these drugs. There is also a tendency for posterior synechia formation. The pupillary block may also be caused because of an anterior movement of the lens iris diaphragm with the pilocarpine. In eyes with uveitis, of course, management of uveitis is basic. After this, for the secondary glaucoma that is caused, beta blockers can be used. Systemic or topical carbonic anhydrase inhibitors work well to control the pressures. Alpha agonists can also be used, though they tend to increase the blood aqueous barrier can be broken with this, and they have also been known to cause granulomatous anterior uveitis. This is something that one needs to keep in mind. What we would like to avoid would be prostaglandin analogs and meiotics because of the inflammation that is there in these eyes. In neovascular glaucoma, again, the same medications of beta blockers, carbonic anhydrase, and alpha agonists can be used. You would, for the same reason as mentioned earlier, because the inflammation that is there in these eyes, pilocarpine and prostaglandins are relatively contraindicated. Also, if there's extensive peripheral anterior synecdoche, the pilocar is likely to be ineffective. These patients, if the neovascular glaucoma is due to diabetic retinopathy, you would want to avoid using drugs such as glycerol. And if the diabetic patient also has nephropathy, which we often see in these patients with neovascular glaucoma, you would want to avoid carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, especially the systemic ones. And of course, the adjunctive management of early detection, managing the inflammation with steroids and cycloplegics, and treat the primary retinal pathology with PRP or anti-VEGF, and controlling the diabetes is of paramount importance. In traumatic glaucomas, Beta blockers, carbonic anhydrase, and alpha agonists are used. Again, avoid drugs that can worsen the inflammation, manage inflammation with the steroids or cycloplegics. In the later stages, when the patient presents with angle recession glaucoma, here we could start with the prostaglandin analog because they work well in this set of patients. Other classes can also be used. Meiotic therapy does not work very well in this situation, or sometimes it may even have a paradoxical effect on the intraocular pressure. In a post-surgical situation where a patient has undergone a penetrating keratoplasty, you would try to avoid a carbonic anhydrase inhibitor because of the negative effect of these drugs on the corneal endothelial pump function. Again, in the postoperative period, you would want to avoid pilocarpine and prostaglandin analogs. Beta blockers and alpha agonists may be tried. Systemic acetazolamide is often required, and the newer drugs, ROCK inhibitors, can work both in reducing the pressure and in helping the reducing corneal edema in these eyes. I would like to conclude by saying that glaucoma treatment must be individualized to optimally manage each patient. Choice of drugs to be guided, keeping in mind the specific type of glaucoma, the age group, and systemic risk. Measure the benefit of preservation of vision against their impact on the quality of life. Careful monitoring and avoiding potentially dangerous side effects is crucial. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Sati, for guiding us through a very important topic where you have to really think before you prescribe. So we'll have a quick pearl of wisdom from Dr. GC, then proceed to the next talk in view of time.
I think Sati, as usual, very comprehensive and covered the topic very elegantly. I have nothing to add. Learned a lot from Sati.
Okay. Thank you, sir. So I think, Shorba, we can
Yes,
proceed to the next talk.
So moving on to the next talk, Expect the Unexpected While Prescribing Glaucoma Medications by Dr. Gauri Murthy. Dr. Gauri is the Chief of Glaucoma Services at Prabha Eye Institute and Vitala International Institute of Ophthalmology. She has extensive experience in managing refractory and difficult glaucoma, as well as in the management of glaucoma in infants and children. Several fellows have received their training in glaucoma under her, and she has guided the thesis of more than 20 postgraduate students. She is involved in a project called Nayana, which empowers rural and semi-urban ophthalmologists in providing glaucoma care since 2006. Welcome and over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Shoruba. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So, in medical management of glaucoma, we think that things have become routine, but we should always be on the guard. So, as Heraclitus once said, if you do not expect the unexpected, you will not recognize it when it arrives. So, it's very, very important to watch out for potential side effects and complications of medical management of glaucoma. And I shall go through small case snippets. And this is not meant to be a comprehensive lecture about all the side effects that one can encounter, but some of the important side effects that one could encounter when you're managing a patient with glaucoma. So this is the first case illustration of mine. This patient is a 68-year-old retired back official, and he has no systemic issues. He was a bilateral angle closure glaucoma patient who had undergone PI. He was on medical management, timolol and dorzolamide and travoprost. He developed a significant cataract in the right eye. And so we took him up for right eye cataract and foldable IOL. So on the OT table, once the monitors were plugged in, the pulse rate was 45 and our anesthetist was quite shocked. And he said, this is 45, what's wrong with this patient? I need to have a look at his ECG and other things. So immediately we've seen this happen in so many patients of ours without realizing beta blockers are common causes of sinus bradycardia. So the patient initially, when you put them on beta blockers, they would not have given you any history of cardiac illness. Like this patient of mine, he had no systemic problems whatsoever. But as they go on using the beta blockers, even timolol 0.5% topically, the amount that gets into the systemic circulation is enough to cause sinus bradycardia. So one should be very wary that this is one of the things that can occur when a patient is on long-term treatment with timolol. So it makes sense once in a while to check the pulse of the patient. There was another instance where the patient said, I won't be able to come in the next few months for a follow-up. And I asked him why. And he said, I'm scheduled for a pacemaker. And then he said that I have sinus bradycardia. That is what my cardiac specialist told me. And there's nothing else wrong, but he wants to implant a pacemaker. Again, there, timolol was the cause. So these are very extreme instances, but please be wary. And also one should check and elicit symptoms. People deny that they have asthma. They think that in their childhood, if they have had the asthma, now they don't have it. So they don't have bronchial asthma. So you should observe patients for breathlessness or wheeze when they're sitting in front of you, or when they are putting their chin on the slit lamp. You can hear their breath. So be observant. And if they have breathlessness or wheeze, check if they are on timolol and take it off. Many times you will solve this problem for the patient. They will not volunteer this information. You should check and elicit the symptoms. So that is one thing. Another small event happened just a few days back in the pandemic, in the lockdown. There is this patient of mine who is a diabetic and hypertensive. He has angle closure glaucoma. He was on topical timolol and bimetoprost, and one of his eyes had very advanced glaucoma. So he had called up and he said, I will come for a checkup, and he came. So this was during the lockdown. So he came with a driver and nobody accompanied him. And this patient, after he came, he was being worked up in the optometrist room. And when the optometrist was checking the vision, she realized that the patient was not alert and kept on repeating the same sentence over and over again. So she was checking the vision, and the 6/24 line, he kept on repeating it. And when she asked him some more questions, sir, how are you? How are you doing? He didn't respond at all. So immediately she came and called me, and we checked his vitals. He was a little incoherent. He was not responding to our questions. Pulse was okay. Blood pressure was okay. And immediately we checked the glucometer random blood sugar. And what did we find? His blood sugar was 38. So he had severe hypoglycemia, and we immediately put an IV line. We started 25% dextrose IV, and he quickly recovered. And then the anesthetist who was there took over the medical management of the patient, and he became all right within a couple of minutes. Ophthalmic timolol treatment can cause altered hypoglycemic response. So this case report, which was way back in 1983, tells that clearly. So in our patient also, the typical hypoglycemic reactions characterized by sweating, uneasiness, and all that are not there. So it is just a changed mental status, which is there as a symptom of the hypoglycemia. So we should warn the patients who are diabetic that their hypoglycemic response may vary, and then they should be aware of this. So this is something that we should keep in mind. So this is another patient of mine, a very meticulous gentleman who was an ex-civil service person. So he was a patient of normal tension glaucoma, hypertensive and diabetic on 10 years on treatment. He had moderate glaucoma in the right eye and mild glaucoma in the left eye. He was on treatment with latanoprost. So because the intraocular pressure was starting to go up, I added brimonidine in his case. So 1 month later, he came for a review, and wife said, doctor, somehow he is very withdrawn, and he also was very listless, and he was not communicating, as enthusiastically as before. So what was happening? Brimonidine. I had started this patient on brimonidine. It is a common cause of central nervous system depression, the activity, and it can cause mild depression in the elderly. So one has to elicit these symptoms. One has to look for change in the patient's behavior. So otherwise this can be missed by the patient or the attender. They will not attribute it to the eye drop that you gave. In their dreams, they will not think that one small eye drop can cause this kind of a change. So you should be the one who will look out for this and should remove the medication if this is causing it. So another instance is a red eye, which is non-resolving in a patient with glaucoma. This was a patient who came for a second opinion. He was a pseudophakic primary open angle glaucoma patient. He was on timolol and travoprost and brinzolamide and brimonidine combination eye drops to his eye. he had a red eye since 3 months, had tried olapatadine, loteprednolone, FML. His local practitioner, ophthalmologist had given all these things, but no response. So look at the patient, you see this excoriated skin lesion on the lid and lot of papillae and follicles on the upper lid palpebral conjunctiva. So many patients develop allergy, and this is very, very significant with brimonidine. And the combination drop of fixed drug combination of brimonidine brinzolamide is very particularly the culprit for this kind of a delayed onset allergy. So please be on the lookout. This makes patient, become non-compliant to drops, and it will lead to a vicious cycle where they are given steroids, which can increase the pressure. Unless you remove the offending agent, the red eye will not resolve. So be very, very careful. Look at the skin around the eye when you're touching the eye. If it is papery, it's not the usual skin texture, be wary. This could very well be an allergy. So another patient with a primary open angle glaucoma, once we diagnosed him, they started him off on latanoprost eye drops once daily in both the eyes. He called the clinic 5 days later and he complained of pain, redness, and photophobia. We said, please come, sir. We would like to have a look at you. And what do we see? So very, very faint scars are there on the cornea, which tell you that this patient has had herpetic keratouveitis earlier. If you don't look at them, and if you're not alert, once you give them a PG analog, you can have a patient who comes back with reactivation of herpetic keratouveitis. So look at the cornea very carefully before starting a PG analog on a patient. So another patient of mine, a lady, she had uveitis, anterior uveitis in both in the eyes, and one eye more than the other. And her pressures were very high with maximal tolerated treatment. That was dorzolamide with timolol and brimonidine. She was intolerant to Dimox. And she was positive for cytomegalovirus on the AC traps, and all other anterior uveitis investigations were normal. She was on systemic valganciclovir. And the anterior uveitis completely resolved, but the IOP remained in the 30s. And this patient was very unwilling for surgery. So we told her that there might be a problem, but we will try a prostaglandin analog. So I added bimetoprost. So immediately after adding bimetoprost, within 2 days, she came back with reactivation of the anterior uveitis. So you can see that uveitis, which is quiet, which is resolved, though prostaglandin analogs are not an absolute contraindication, it's relatively contraindicated, and you should always be alert to the possibility of a reactivation, and especially viral uveitis. These uveitis can relapse after starting prostaglandin analogs. And there are a lot of cosmetic issues with prostaglandin analogs, the increased lash length and the periocular pigmentation. When you're treating patients unilaterally, be very careful, because this kind of a difference can become very marked and it can be cosmetically embarrassing for the patient. The newer drug on the block, that is netarsudil, sometimes can cause hemorrhages. The subconjunctival hemorrhages like this and hyperemia are common side effects. It can be seen up to 12% in patients of patients who are on netarsudil, and hyperemia in up to 50% of patients is seen. And sometimes if there is corneal vascularization, like in this patient, even corneal hemorrhages have been reported. We should not forget that the additives themselves may be a cause for a problem. So very rarely benzalkonium chloride, patient may be allergic to it. So whatever topical drop you give, the patient develops an allergy. So in such patients, be alert and switch over to alternate preservatives or preservative-free formulation. So this is just a bird's eye view. One should be aware of the systemic side effects, the local side effects, and the interaction of our glaucoma medications with the general medications that the patient is taking. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Gauri, for taking us through real case scenarios. And these case scenarios are definitely not very uncommon, but we definitely need an eye to look for them and take care that the patient does not adversely get affected by the medication than the disease. So I think I would have one question for Dr. GC, that how frequently do you think is the role of preservative-free drugs, which are very common these days? Every company is coming out with preservative-free drugs. So what would be the, importance? Would there be any patients where we would be directly starting with these drugs unless there is a surface disease, or what do you think?
In all patients who have had a corneal procedure like keratoplasty, the preservative-free medications may become the first line of drug to be used. By and large, most of the glaucoma patients that we see probably do not require the preservative-free medications. But like what Gauri very nicely said, if you are not aware and if you are not looking out for the surface problems produced by your glaucoma medications, you will miss them. And Sushmita very clearly said, we don't listen to the patients enough. So if you're not listening to the patients enough, and if you're not paying attention to the subtle signs that may be there and not paying attention to them, we will be doing a disservice to the patient. If both those things are kept in mind, then probably the need for the preservative-free medications is not going to be for every glaucoma patient. But in those situations where we need to use them, we will not use them unless we are aware of the indication for using them. I think all the three talks, Sushmita's and Sati Devi's and Gauri's, have been very illuminating for a regular practice. I'm glad I attended your session. Thank you.
So do you, and this question is to all the panelists, I would say, that do you feel there is a difference in efficacy when you use preservative-free drops or the conventionally, the ones that we use?
I have tried only with Saflutan, the preservative-free Saflutan and the regular Saflutan. Both are of the same efficacy. There is not much of a difference.
What about the other drugs? Like now we have beta blockers and even alpha agonists and even carbonic anhydrase inhibitors without preservatives. Have you tried? Dr. Sati, Dr. Sushmita? Dr. Sushmita is left. Dr. Sati?
I really haven't noticed any kind of difference between the with or without the preservatives. I think efficacy-wise, they seem to work just as well. Of course, this is my clinical impression.
I think the only preservative-free, totally preservative-free is the one with the Unims, which is Saflutan. Timolol used to come, but now you don't get that any longer. So they are all with alternate preservatives other than benzalkonium chloride.
Than DAT. Dr. Chandrima, any thoughts?
Yeah, actually, I don't think there's a difference in the efficacy, but in Taflupras, the Saflutan, I found a vast difference in the patient's, compliance once I switched them over to the Saflutan S. There's a huge difference in the price though, but the patients are much more comfortable with the preservative-free version than the one with the preservative.
Right. Okay, thank you. I think we'll proceed to the next talk. Shorba.
Yes. So our next talk is Remembering Pilocarpine and the Relevance of PGA in PACG by Dr. Chandrima Paul. Dr. Chandrima is the Director and Consultant of the Glaucoma Service at BBI Foundation Group of Hospitals, West Bengal. She has done her graduation and post-graduation from Silchar Medical College, Assam. She has also trained under the renowned surgeon Dr. Howard Fine at Oregon Eye Center, USA. She has completed her PhD in ophthalmology with a subspecialty as glaucoma from RIO, Kolkata. She has received the prestigious D.B. Chandra Award at AIOS and B.K. Mitra Award in the West Bengal Ophthalmic Society. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shorba. I'll share my screen. Thank you, Dr. Sushma, for giving me this opportunity this evening. And it's always a privilege to have Dr. GC on the chair, because every time that I've heard him, I've always learned something from him. So remembering pilocarpine and relevance of PG analogs. So in medical school, we heard that if angle assessment is not possible, remember pilocarpine. The first part of the statement, I would say, doesn't hold true anymore, because we must do a gonioscopy, actually, come what may. But the second part of the sentence, let's remember pilocarpine, yes, we should remember pilocarpine. So, pilocarpine, the origin of the drug, was obtained from the leaves of Pilocarpus microphyllus. It's a South American shrub and was isolated as early as 1875. That's the molecular structure. And it's a myotic. So myotics are parasympathomimetic drugs that act by stimulating muscarinic receptors in sphincter pupillae and ciliary body. In primary open-angle glaucoma, intraocular pressure by contraction of ciliary, it reduces the intraocular pressure by contraction of the ciliary muscle and increases the aqueous outflow through the trabecular meshwork. In angle closure glaucoma, it reduces the intraocular pressure by contraction of the sphincter pupillae, causing meiosis, and pulls peripheral iris away from the trabeculum, opening the angle. That's a more of a mechanical action. So just to emphasize the importance of gonioscopy, that's an open angle that we see out there. We can clearly see all the structures that one is supposed to see while doing a gonioscopy. And this is a closed angle where we cannot see a single structure. So that's on UBM, an open angle. And that's a closed angle. What is important to remember here is the scleral spur. That is the identification point on the UBM. And that's the anterior OCT. We have a lot of talks on anterior OCT, but as far as angle closure is concerned, the UBM gives you much more depth than the anterior OCT. So before laser peripheral iridotomy, the code from Krupin et al. Was pilocarpine 2% or 4% was administered in all patients prior to laser surgery to have a myotic pupil and the iris under tension. Well, that holds good even today. We do use pilocarpine. We do not get the 4%, but we use the 2% to cause meiosis and reduce iris thickness and facilitate perforation. So the biological mechanism of pilocarpine to induce meiosis quantifies short-term constriction of the pupil induced by pilocarpine, and it's very significant. So meiosis begins in about 15 to 30 minutes and lasts for about 8 hours. Pilocarpine also causes meiosis by direct action on the receptors of the pupillary sphincter, and this meiosis may last even up to 24 hours and cause spasm of accommodation. So because of its activity at the muscarinic receptor sites on the iris sphincter and ciliary muscles, pilocarpine causes pupillary constriction and varying degrees of accommodative spasm depending on the patient's age. And in all comparative studies comparing the effect of pilocarpine to other drugs or combination, meiosis is mentioned as the reason making mask studies very impossible. And this I really found whole goods, because searching the literature, I could hardly find any recent studies because it's almost impossible to do a study with pilocarpine where you have to cause meiosis. So that's the UBM picture. This is a UBM picture of the closed angle. That's pre-pilocarpine, and that's post-pilocarpine. And this is post-YAG-PI. So coming to plateau iris, which is very significant in this talk. So the prevalence is about 32.3% in a cohort of primary angle closure suspects using UBM. Risk factors are female, younger age, 30 to 50. Often family history is positive, less hyperopic than patients with primary angle closure. So the pathophysiology is anteriorly positioned ciliary processes. A component of pupillary block may be present. And here we need to distinguish between the plateau iris configuration and syndrome. So the plateau iris configuration is flat central iris plane, but normal AC depth. Angle recess is very narrow with a sharp iris angulation over anteriorly positioned or oriented ciliary processes. A component of pupillary block is present, and a peripheral iridotomy is curative. In plateau iris syndrome, occurrence of angle closure despite a patent iridotomy in a patient with morphological plateau iris. So in the presence of an anteriorly directed ciliary body and absent ciliary sulcus, a steep iris root from its point of insertion, followed by a downward angulation from the sclerocorneal wall, the presence of a centrally flat iris plane and irido-angle contact. So if you look at the picture out there, plateau iris, a large and anteriorly positioned ciliary body, holds the iris root up against the cornea, leading to a partially occluded angle. The arrows represent the location of the scleral spur. That's the scleral spur, and there I'm just coming to the double hump. So the indentation UBM on an eye with plateau iris, the double hump sign, you can see that's actually in gonioscopy where you see the double hump sign, or the sine wave sign as we call it, and that's in the UBM, where also you see one hump owing to the ciliary processes and the other hump owing to the lens. So pilocarpine 1% muscarinic agents, these facilitate aqueous humor outflow through the ciliary muscle contraction. distance the iris peripherally from the trabecular meshwork and prevent synechia formation, but do not totally remove iridotrabecular contact. Miotic agents open the angle, reducing the intraocular pressure by 20 to 25%. Adverse reactions can be local, ocular pain, conjunctival hyperemia, pupillary constriction, myopia, or even retinal detachment, or in general bronchospasm, headache, and intestinal cramps. This treatment is an option for acute and intermittent angle closure and is mainly reserved for patients who do not consent to laser therapy. Miotics can also be used for the prevention of the angle closure after laser iridotomy or argon laser peripheral iridoplasty. So next we move on to the game changer. The game changer today is none other than the PG analogs. My previous speakers have very beautifully spoken about PG analogs, so I won't go into the details. I'll just cover up a few points. That is, just looking at the glaucoma treatment landscape. Latanoprost came in as early as 1997, which was followed by bimatoprost, then travoprost, and finally trafluprost. And prostaglandin analogs in the eye, I wouldn't go into the details of how they function because my previous speakers have already said all that. So I'll just move on to a few points like we use tafluprost, latanoprost, travoprost, and of course bimatoprost. The difference between them, as we all know, these are one is the bimatoprost is a amide and the other are esters. So prostaglandin analogs, it is the drug of choice in primary open angle glaucoma and normotensive glaucoma, PI in angle closure glaucoma, and really have no side effects except, of course, you can't use it in pregnant women. And compliance improves because it's a single application. So in this talk here, actually, the relevance is post-IAC PI. You can actually use a prostaglandin analog, and interswitching among them. Studies have shown that patients not responding or intolerant to one class of PGS benefit from switching to another class of PGS. Contraindications, I wouldn't go through it because it was dealt with very nicely by my previous speakers, so I won't go into that. So just the comparison that PG analogs are the most effective when compared to the carbonic anhydrase inhibitors or the alpha agonists or timolol. And the 24-hour effect of medications, well, if you look at that, then latanoprost actually, as opposed to prostaglandin analog, has the best IOP lowering activity, both when you compare it to the other drugs and even on a baseline IOP, it has the best effect of IOP lowering efficacy. And if you look at this, that is over a 24-hour period, then compared to a beta blocker, a prostaglandin analog has much better effect, especially at night in lowering IOP than the contender beta blocker. So for controlling intraocular pressure, recent studies have suggested evidently that latanoprost, travoprost, and bimatoprost provide a significant IOP lowering efficacy in eyes with angle closure glaucoma and are as effective as timolol for the same. So statistically speaking, the efficiency of these three drugs is similar when compared to each other. And recent studies, as we just spoke about it, about the VAC-free and the preservative-free, we just spoke about them. So PGAs are also very effective when they're added to either alpha agonist or a beta blocker or a carbonic anhydrase inhibitor. And they can be successfully combined with any of them. So issues to consider when starting a prostaglandin analog, we need to take a history of any active inflammation or a history of cystoid macular edema. And if the dosage in one, if you're putting it in one eye, it has to tolerate the potential asymmetric changes that happen. And that's actually an article which we published just to show that angle closure is almost as common in primary glaucoma. And that's the reason. So what we see depends on what we look for. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Dr. Chandrima, for nicely reminding us how important it is to remember the good old drugs as well, particularly the pilocarpine for angle closure glaucoma. Shoruba, if we have any questions directed to Dr. Chandrima, we should take now because she also has to head for a session, I think. So do we have any questions from audience?
Right now, no specific questions.
Dr. GC, would you like to say something?
No, I think it's well covered. Nothing specific to add.
So thanks, Dr. Chandrima. We'll move on to the next talk now. Thanks for being part of this course. I know you have to rush to other sessions also. Multiple parallel sessions are going on. Thank you so much. So, Shorba, we can.
Yes. So moving on to our last talk for this session, New Kid on the Block by Dr. S. Kavita. Dr. Kavita heads the glaucoma department at Arvind Eye Hospital, Pondicherry. She graduated from Tanjavur Medical College and did her master's from Arvind Eye Hospital, Madurai. She is actively involved in training of residents and fellows. She is one of the key investigators in the landmark iFace trial conducted at Arvind in collaboration with the Wilmer Eye Institute. She has won the Best Paper, Poster, and Video awards from various ophthalmic societies, including the Tamil Nadu Ophthalmic Society, AIOS, and GSI. So, welcome and over to you, Dr. Kavita.
Thank you, Dr. Sharuba, for the kind introduction. So, let's proceed with the talk. My topic for today is the newer kid on the block, the ROCK inhibitors. I do not have any financial interest in the subject matter of presentation. So why do we need to have a new drug? As we all know, and as we have been discussing for the past more than 1 hour, we know the one and only modifiable risk factor in the management of glaucoma is the control of intraocular pressure. And the primary method or the first line of management to achieve this in most of the patients is with the medical therapy. Though we have alternate line of treatment like neuroprotection and the newer drugs and the newer drug delivery system are coming into practice like or still on the research side, and nothing has come to daily practice. And actually in the literature, if we look at after the pilocarpine, we don't have any drug which acts on the conventional outflow pathway, which is actually responsible for 75% of the aqueous resistance and which is responsible for causing glaucoma. So this shows the timeline of the various glaucoma medications. We can see after the introduction of prostaglandin analogs, almost for past 20 years, we don't have any new medications coming into the practice. So that's how this Rho kinase inhibitor evolved. And these Rho kinase are small G proteins, and they get activated by binding to guanosine triphosphatase, exert their action through actin and actomycin assembly, and the results will be the cellular contraction, cell adhesion, and ECM organization. So these Rho kinase inhibitors, they inhibit the Rho kinase isoforms which are present in the trabecular meshwork. It alters the cytoskeleton of the trabecular meshwork and the Schlemm scan, reduces the resistance to the aqueous outflow, and that reduces the intraocular pressure. This is showing a various mechanism of actions of this Rho kinase inhibitors. Apart from reducing the intraocular pressure, there are another few. It prevents the transdifferentiation of the myofibroblast from the Tenon's fibroblast, which is responsible for subconjunctival scarring, which is the main mechanism for the trabeculectomy failure. And this drug is helpful in preventing the scarring. Also, because of its properties on the blood vessels, vasodilative properties, it increases the blood flow to the retinal ganglion cells, and also it prevents apoptosis, and hence it is supposed to have neuroprotective effects. So this shows the various ROCK inhibitors in the market, either in the research side or a few of the drugs like Ripasidil and Etasidil are now available in India also. Fasidil has been there for quite long time. Used as a vasodilator in patients with stroke for the cerebral vasospasm. And the first ROCK inhibitor to receive the marketing authorization is Ripasidil, which is for glaucoma and ocular hypertension, approved in 2014, and it is used as a 0.4% formulation in a twice daily preparation. Kanihara et al. Did a study to assess the various formulations of Ripasidil and compared it with the placebo. 0.2% and 0.4% were compared with the placebo in patients with POAG and ocular hypertension. And Ripasidil, especially 0.4%, evolved as a promising new topical medication to lower the intraocular pressure at least for 7 hours in these patients with POAG and ocular hypertension. So this figure shows intraocular pressure reduction 2 hours after the first installation and 2 hours after the second installation, which is 6.4 and 7.3 respectively. Again, this is the results of post-marketing surveillance study, again by Tanihara et al. And this is a 2-year surveillance study, and the 3 months interim results are out, and the 2-year surveillance study got over only in 2020. We need to wait for the results. In this study, they analyzed the intraocular pressure control and the adverse drug reactions in the first 3 months in 3,058 patients. 8% of them developed adverse drug reaction in the first 3 months, and the most commonest being, as discussed by the previous speakers, it is conjunctival hyperemia. And mean intraocular pressure change was 2.6 plus or minus 4.1 millimeters of mercury. However, we need to wait for long-term results. In this ROCJ trial, there were various other things were evaluated. This figure shows the evaluation in different types of glaucoma. So we can see a significant reduction in the intraocular pressure from baseline in almost all the types of glaucoma. And this is regarding the various range of intraocular pressure. We can see here again, there was a significant reduction from baseline. However, we can see here the maximum pressure reduction was with those who had a higher baseline intraocular pressure, which happens with any other drug. And also they evaluated in different forms of secondary glaucomas. It was effective in exfoliation glaucoma, uveitic glaucoma, and also steroid-induced glaucoma, though the numbers were not too high. But it was not effective in neovascular glaucoma. As we know, the pathology is different here. And also it was evaluated in 5 different groups of patients, either as an initial monotherapy or initial combination therapy or switchover therapy from previous treatment as add-on only drug or add-on drug with other anti-glaucoma medications. Again, it was proven to be effective in all the 5 groups. So it was also tested as a fixed combination with timolol and latanoprost, and with timolol, it was effective as a combination both during the peak and during the trough, but with latanoprost, it was effective only during the peak. Coming to the adverse drug reactions, the most commonest is the conjunctival hyperemia, and it is very important to educate the patient because of this possible side effects. Otherwise, most of these patients will discontinue the drug because of this particular side effect. The other possible side effects include blepharitis, allergic conjunctivitis, and punctate keratitis. As glaucoma consultants, we are also very much worried about the corneal endothelium. So because raised intraocular pressure as such can damage the corneal endothelial cells, and some drugs can be even cytotoxic to these endothelial cells. And even after following a glaucoma surgery or a cataract surgery also, there can be an endothelial compromise. And this new drug, this RAC inhibitors have shown promising results in animal models. When combined injection of this endothelial cell culture along with the ROCK inhibitors are given as intracameral injection, and these drug was now found to increase the cellular proliferation and cell addition, which seems to be promising in conditions such as fugues or acute corneal injury following a trauma or intraocular surgery. It is also showing some promising results again in the animal models following initial stages of diabetic retinopathy. If given as repeated intravitreal injections, it is supposed to prevent progression to the severe form of diseases such as proliferative diabetic retinopathy. However, we need to wait for long-term results. Next in line is netarsidil. It is approved in USA as a 0.02% formulation, as in the name of Ropresa. In India also we have these drugs available in the form of Netalo and Reiki. However, these are relatively new drugs, and this the one unique thing about this drug is the triple action drug. Apart from being a rho kinase inhibitor and increasing the conventional outflow as discussed earlier with Repasodil, this is a norepinephrine transport inhibitor, and thereby it reduces the aqueous production. Also, it reduces the episcleral venous pressure. So it has got 3 mechanisms by which it takes care of the intraocular pressure. Bracket 1 and 2 trials evaluated netarsidil and compared with timolol, where it was proven to be non-inferior to timolol only in patients whose intraocular pressure, presenting pressures were less than 25 millimeters of mercury. However, this drug was not found to be non-inferior to latanoprost. So in this drug trials, even the fixed combination, the twice daily dosage and once daily dosage were compared with the timolol. Both the dosages, though they were non-inferior to timolol, when we increased the dosage to twice daily, the adverse reactions increased. Also, after the trial, and this was found to be as can be recommended as a first-line therapy in patients with normal tension glaucoma. Coming to the adverse drug reactions, again, conjunctival hyperemia is very common as with Ripasidil, and as shown by Dr. Gauri, the small petechial microhemorrhages in the conjunctiva and the cornea are common, and these are actually reversible while stopping the drug. And cornea verticillata, as shown here, though this looks like really scary, this does not interfere with and this also self-resolving on cessation of the drug. The other effects include installation site pain, erythema, blurred vision, and increased lacrimation. So fixed combination has also been approved in US in the name of Rocklatan, and this fixed combination Rocklatan of Netarsidil and Latanoprast has proven to be very effective as compared to either monotherapy with Netarsidil or with Latanoprast. So the potential drawbacks of Netarsidil include it may not be effective. They are potent vasodilators, can cause hyperemia and subconjunctival hemorrhages. And because of this dilatation, there is a danger of greater systemic absorption of the concomitantly administered drugs, and it might also decrease the ocular potency. And it might be worsening the uveitis, although it is not yet reported. So where do we keep these ROCK inhibitors? We need till date also, the prostaglandin analogs gives the maximum pressure reduction and will continue to be the first line of drug. And to summarize, Ripasidil 0.4% twice daily preparation increases the trabecular outflow. It is neuroprotective and improves the ocular blood flow and prevents conjunctival scarring, especially post-glaucoma surgery. Netarsidil is a triple action drug, and the adverse reaction include corneal conjunctival hyperemia, subconjunctival petechial hemorrhages, and cornea verticillata. To conclude, these drugs can be used as a first-line agents in normal tension glaucoma, and they might be effective in certain forms of glaucoma where the pathology lies in the outflow like steroid-induced glaucoma. It can be effective as a combination therapy with prostaglandin analog, has a good role as an adjuvant therapy, as an add-on therapy when we want to postpone a surgical intervention, and it has protective effect on the corneal endothelium, and it inhibits the fibroblasts and prevents subconjunctival scarring. So when to prescribe? So conditions in which timolol is contraindicated, as discussed very well by my previous speakers, and conditions where prostaglandin analogs are contraindicated like inflammatory conditions or allergic reaction. It's valuable in patients as an add-on therapy, and in patients who have associated corneal pathology or a post-corneal grafting, this is very helpful, and we can prefer Ripasidil in case if we want to start an anti-glaucoma medication post-incisional surgery. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, Dr. Sushma and the AOC. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Kavita, for taking us through the new drug indications and its role. I think we have only 5 minutes now for the question answer session. So I think Shoruba, you can shoot the questions.
So I think based on the unfortunate pandemic situation that we're in, I was just wondering whether our panelists have felt in the last 1 year a significant decrease in compliance when it comes to glaucoma medications. Anyone who would like to take the question?
There was a recent study from Aravind Hospital, Madurai, where they have conducted a telephonic survey, and they found a vast majority of the patients, almost 70% of the patients were not compliant, either due to the non-availability of the medications or because of transport issues or financial issues. Definitely, it is a huge problem which we'll be facing. And now also, maybe probably once the pandemic numbers comes down, so our OP usually gets hiked up and we get to see many patients who miss their drug and miss their appointments.
Thank you.
I think all of us are seeing more of progression or loss of follow-ups during the pandemic, so that's a bad situation. Yeah, go ahead, Shoruba.
I was just, is there anybody would like to comment on any experience with citicolin as a neuroprotector? Dr. Gauri, ma'am?
I have personally no experience, neither am I convinced about the neuroprotective efficacy of this drug.
Dr. GC wants to say something
Yes.
about citicolin. So you have to unmute yourself.
I agree with Gauri that it's not convincing, and a lot of publications like what you mentioned also very carefully about the blood flow effects of dorzolamide as well as the neuroprotective effect of brimonidine. These are all marketing gimmicks and publications, one-off publications that people keep on quoting. So we need to be careful and truthful to the patients.
Thank you, sir. Just a very basic question about this punctal occlusion. I was just wondering whether our panelists would like to comment on it. But do you tell all your patients about punctal occlusion every time we prescribe a glaucoma drug? Or is it only to those patients who have systemic side effects, systemic contraindications that we tell them about it?
I give them the option to either close their eyes for at least 3 minutes following the drop application or do the punctal occlusion. So I think it's important. I think Sushmita also must have mentioned that the drop application method we pay attention to teach the patient and to tell them about what are all the things that you can do when you're putting the drops. Though I will be truthful, I don't tell every one of my patients about the punctal occlusions. We do give them brochures whenever we start patients on medical treatment, and it is mentioned in that. They ask me how long should I keep the eye closed, what should I do? So to that specific answers are given.
Another, I think, common thing that we keep hearing is about how frequently you give lubricants along with the glaucoma medications.
Only when it is necessary, Dr. Sushma. I think we cannot burden patients with an additional drop all the time. I mean, if a single drop of prostaglandin analog patient has no problems, why should we unnecessarily prescribe a lubricant? I mean, if there is a clear-cut indication that there is some dry eye and the patient is also symptomatic, then I would add a lubricant along with it.
And I think also we need to be careful about, because so many lubricants being in the market, we should be careful for glaucoma patients. We only need to give a CMC or maximum hydroxymethyl cellulose and not the others that would prevent the absorption of the drug or prevent the primary purpose of the treatment.
True.
And in continuity with the previous question, how frequently do we see, or how frequently do you all see in your clinical practice systemic side effects such as bradycardia, worsening of asthma, patients coming back and complaining that they either had an episode of brady? Any thoughts on that?
I think I spoke about it. It's fairly, I mean, you have to be alert. Bradycardia is very common. And asthma, many people don't mention. I mean, you ask them straight, they say, no, I have no asthma. But when they come for follow-up, if you listen, they will have a slight breathing difficulty. Sometimes that happens. And people change over time. See, you'll have put timolol and you keep following up these patients. 5 years later, 6 years later, the systemic status changes. So you can have unexpected side effects develop.
So I think we are about time to close. Dr. GC, we can hear from you last minute.
I think the medical management of glaucoma is a very important topic, and we have covered a lot of ground. The important take-home message probably is owning the responsibility that we are not doing as much as we could potentially do to our patients by way of our communication, by way of awareness of the side effects that we can produce, and being in a busy clinic should not be an excuse for not being communicative with the patient. Like I said, we need to be differentiating between patients who are responsible versus patients who are over worried, patients who are callous, by assessing that aspect of the patient to treat the patient as a whole rather than just the eye and the intraocular pressure. I think in that aspect, we can all keep on improving. Me at this age and all of you also. So that should be the take home message.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. GC, for nicely summing it up. And I must thank all of you. I'm really grateful that all of you could make it, despite of this being very last minute, and make it a very educative experience for all of us. Thanks, Dr. GC. Thanks, Dr. Gauri, Dr. Sati, Dr. Kavita, Shoruba, and Dr. Sushmita and Dr. Chandrima, though they are not here. Thank you once again.
Thanks, Sushma.
Thank
It was
you.
a wonderful session.